answer this question, what's next for nuclear power? So I'm here today because I believe nuclear power enables us to fight climate change. There's a lot of issues, and we'll talk about them briefly, but I got interested in nuclear to fight climate change. If carbon dioxide didn't cause global warming and we didn't have to deal with it, I'm fine not having nuclear power. I don't have any love for it, but I really believe in this to fight climate change. And there are a lot of nuclear advocates out there, especially on YouTube. If you go, why nuclear power or whatever, there's a really great talk by Michael Schellenberger. I recommend. He really goes through the whole kind of economics and all that. That's not my job. That's not my comparative advantage in speaking. I'm an engineer. This is what I work on, and that's what I like to talk about. So if you really want that, excuse me, you're a little bit disappointed, I can fake it. But that's not really what I'm here for. I'm an engineer. I really want to talk about technology. There's a lot of people who've never heard about nuclear, but there's a lot of people who are really excited about nuclear. And if you're excited about nuclear, I want to be both like a damper and an expectation setter on what is really possible and what the technology really brings. And the last point is questions. So I will go off on really, really long tangents. So if we have any hope of getting through my slides, if I say something that you think you should understand and I don't understand, don't explain it well, then definitely interrupt me with a question. But if you want to talk about something else, I'll be here until everyone else goes home. So if you have questions, I'll definitely get to them after. So this is maybe what I really want to talk about. This is one of my favorite graphs. It's just a bunch of nuclear data, and there's so much physics in here that you can explain with just this slide. I could talk for an hour about it, but that probably wouldn't be that interesting to everyone here, although some of you might be interested. So instead, I really kind of want to lay some groundwork, and then we're going to talk about what could happen with nuclear technology. So just to comment at the outset, I'm not a prophet of nuclear power. I'm not a true believer. There's definitely flaws, and there's, it's not perfect. There are no perfect solutions. So safety, Fukushima, 3 Mile Island, there have been accidents, Chernobyl. There have been health effects from nuclear power. I'm not going to deny that. Nuclear waste is a real thing we have to deal with. Cost, if nuclear power stays as expensive as it is, it doesn't really matter if I advocate for it. No one will build it. People would rather have climate change than $14 a watt installed electricity. Uranium mining, has definitely a destructive past, and that's maybe one that could have a little bit more of a future. And proliferation is something that I actually don't personally find as compelling argument against nuclear, but a lot of people raise it. So with all those objections, and definitely I'm sure a lot of people have questions about those, but with all those, why do I look past all of that and still believe in nuclear power? And it's really this. So this is a screen grab of the German utility puts out the different sources of electricity generation by hour for a given week. And this made a lot of headlines if you're really nerdy into this space. So January 18th, I believe, or January 2018 at 3 a.m. But the headline said, Germany gets 100% of their energy from renewables. And at 3 a.m. on a very windy day with low energy demand, Germany got 100% of their energy from wind and a tiny bit of solar. I think maybe it's solar thermal, I don't know why 3 a.m. But so last time I kind of gave this talk, I pulled up the week before that talk, and that was this. So this is a much more typical week. It was a cloudy week with not a lot of wind, and most of their power was from burning coal. So if we really want to fight climate change, we need a lot of power, and we need carbon-free power, or low-carbon power. So nuclear power comes with inherent risk, challenges, and costs. But tackling climate change requires us to make hard choices. There are no easy choices yet.
Will it be available?
What?
Will the presentation be available?
Maybe. If you email me directly, email you. I don't have it listed. And I'll be available. But tackling climate change requires us to make hard choices. I think there's a lot of people who believe batteries are getting cheaper, solar is getting cheaper. There was a big headline like 2 weeks ago that there was a contract for solar storage in Tucson for 4.3 cents a kilowatt, which is a pretty good price, for 4 hours of solar storage. It hasn't been built yet. And so that's in Tucson. People need power in a lot of places that are cloudier than Tucson. So batteries might work, but if you look at it, as you go from even 80%, we're at like 1% today. We need to get to 80%, and then from 80 to 100%, trying to do that with batteries and solar, to not have blackouts every day, you really need a low carbon, scalable source of electricity that's available on demand to not have huge overbuilds of generation or storage. And there just really aren't a lot of options for reliable low carbon energy that we can scale. Geothermal is very location dependent. I mean, there are other options at small scale, like wind, wave power, but they're not geographically scalable like nuclear is. There are issues with nuclear, but there are issues with cutting out nuclear as well. There's issues with shutting down our existing nuclear fleet. And there's no easy choices if we want to decarbonize. So that's pretty much where I'm coming from. Any point I just said can be debated ad nauseum. That's just this is my groundwork of the rest of the talk. So really, if you kind of buy that premise that we need nuclear, what is nuclear? What do we have today? What can we have tomorrow? So that's sort of what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this, but since I got through that actually fairly quickly, maybe just pause for a second. Did I totally lose anyone? No? Cool. Oh, yeah.
So I know, for instance, how do you, or rather my question is, how do you handle situations where you need energy on demand? So in that case, for instance, you might power on natural gas because it can be powered on kind of instantaneously, as opposed to something like coal that takes a little while longer. So how does this fit into that?
So as you look at like scaling up, renewable energy, for example, and you sort of need dispatchable sources to cover that mismatch of like, it's been 4 days since the sun has shone, you have this really unusually cloudy period. When you look at scaling up just pure 100% solar, you sort of have to make this trade of how often do I want blackouts versus how many diesel generators and simple cycle natural gas plants do you want. Nuclear, you sort of assume runs as baseline. So if you're building nuclear, that's sort of the baseline assumption. There are advanced plants that can load follow and sort of play with renewables. In terms of carbon intensity of, hey, I have a natural gas plant, but it only turns on once a year for 2 days. What's the carbon intensity of that versus building 10,000 more batteries? I don't know that answer, right? That's analysis I really want someone to do. But I don't quite have the time to do it. I have a feeling that there's sort of a point where you'd say, wow, it'd be really nice if I had 20% that was always on to charge the batteries or something. I'm not saying, I've met people who say, like, we should just do 100% nuclear and batteries handle the load following. Like, I'm not a nuclear iconoclast. Solar does get cheaper. Batteries do get cheaper. Wind works. I got into this field because I really wanted to work on wind. But it's really that mismatch between how do we not just cut our carbon intensity, but how do we decarbonize? And it's really hard to imagine decarbonizing electricity, which is only the first of like 5 steps. If I go too far down this path, we'll all be depressed. But so it's to get to that point, you need something that's on all the time. Yeah.
Can we just go back to the slide of Germany and mix? Can you comment on the nuclear composition there?
Yeah. So nuclear is, I believe this comes now. Great one, this one. So Germany had somewhere like 25 nuclear reactors. Nico, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But order of magnitude there. After Fukushima, they decided to shut all their plants down. They've shut down about 8, and they have 12 left, so it would be 20. Or 12 and 8. They're somewhere in the middle of cutting down. They're about halfway through turning off their entire nuclear fleet. I want to say 100%, but I'll be conservative and say more than 90% of the energy that they've displaced by shutting off nuclear has been replaced with coal. And not high-grade coal, but like low-grade coal. So there's Germany, I don't know, is big. You're like sort of indicating on Germany. There's a lot of fun articles to read out there on their carbon intensity. They're abandoning all their carbon reduction goals, even as they build solar, it's the largest expenditure on renewable energy ever over 10 years, and their carbon intensity is going up almost entirely because they're shutting nuclear down. And as they build non-dispatchable renewables, they're having to back that up with natural gas. So, like, Germany is a sort of like a pillory post of people saying like, hey, don't shut down all your nuclear plants because their carbon intensity, while they're, everyone's like, oh, Germany, hit 100% solar, but like people track renewables, and that's a big pet peeve of mine. They say like renewable portfolio standards, we'll talk about in a second. It's like, hey, we have 50% renewables, but what's your carbon intensity? Well, it's gone up. But we have 50% renewables. So So did that answer your question at all?
Yeah, it was a more general comment. So what you see was.
Yeah. So for this is a more typical day. You have basically wind that sort of varies as you go through the day. Solar kind of peaks at noon every day. And then it sort of looks weird because you're stacked on top of it. It's total generation, and there's exports in there too that they're selling to the rest of the European grid. But they have these big fat bands of this is brown coal and lignite and hard coal. One of those is worse than the other. They're both really bad.
And what is conventional power plants? Is it?
I think that's natural gas and.
There is
Not-
natural gas,
Yeah.
and there is like coal and lignite, and so what's conventional?
You know, I don't know. I'm pretty sure it is current. Yeah.
In your assessment of the future potential ability of solar and wind to deliver, how much are you including the plans by countries like Morocco for huge scale solar farms and places like Texas to put in huge scale wind farms? And also, what would be the impact on the carbon footprint of increasing the reliability of our transmission lines? Isn't something like 30% of our electricity lost from generation to reception? Could we make up that difference by changing that back?
Yeah, so like the potential of large scale solar is big and we should exploit it. Transmission's hard. Building transmission lines, building high voltage transmission lines, building the transformers, those are all huge infrastructure projects that are really hard in practice to implement in terms of like clearing the land for that transmission and everything. And I think there's a lot of countries that are very far from the sort of solar belt, Morocco, Texas, or whatever. So like I would be totally happy, and coincidentally Stephen Chu totally agrees, like his ideal energy mix is like 80% wind and solar and 20% nuclear. If we maintain 20% nuclear, I'll be very happy. Right now we're looking at going to 0 in the next 30 years. And that's globally, right? The US is 20%, globally it's like 5%. So having that power to cover the night, to charge the batteries overnight, to charge the batteries when it happens to be a cloudy day in Morocco, or cloudy day in Scandinavia, which happens really frequently. So that's sort of that's sort of how I feel about that. I'm gonna pause my questioning and continue. So my internal clock says I'm off. So just sort of domestically in the U.S., what is nuclear power today? There's 99 operating reactors, but a really kind of emblematic one is Palo Verde. Palo Verde is just like personally as a nuclear nerd, a super cool plant. It's the largest plant in the world that's not cooled by a source of water, a natural source of water. It's 100% of its cooling capacity comes from City of Phoenix sewage. So City of Phoenix sends its slightly treated sewage water to Palo Verde that cools the steam generators, or that cools the turbines, and then they send that back. And so if you actually drive west on 10, you will see this huge plume of steam coming out of the desert, and it's City of Phoenix sewage water. It was one of the most recently built plants. It was built at a pretty reasonable $3.60 a watt, which is very comparable with like solar, wind, natural gas plants today. I mean, natural gas can come in a little cheaper than that, but for the carbon intensity, it's pretty good bang for your buck. The kind of forward operating cost of electricity, so that's not counting the already paid debt, that's future debt service and fuel, operating maintenance, etc., is 4.3 cents a kilowatt, which is again very competitive considering the reliability, and it produces its nameplate capacity 95% of the time compared to wind and solar, which is about 20 to 30% depending on where it is.
Who lives there?
What?
Who lives there?
Who lives
around the Palo Verde plant?
So the town of Palo Verde is right there. I've driven there. It's actually very lovely. Yeah, people. So every nuclear power plant today in the U.S. has what's called the exclusion zone, which is 1 kilometer around the plant, and then there's a 10-mile evacuation planning zone where the power plant is responsible for ensuring alarms and ensuring transportation. That's due to the design of these plants. If there's a major kind of once-in-a-generation accident, there's supposed to be the network in place to evacuate people. Most communities that live next to nuclear power plants end up being in favor of the plants because people work there and people see it. So people like one shell removed that end up being, the people that don't work there but live close enough to be in the exclusion zone. But most plants are built in relatively low populated areas just because of the cost of that evacuation planning. But one of the kind of things about Palo Verde is it supplies electricity to 7 or 8 states, and there's a ballot initiative in November to go to a 50% renewable portfolio standard for Arizona. So that would say 50% of the net generation in Arizona has to come from wind or solar. It doesn't say low carbon, it doesn't say anything about carbon intensity, it's wind or solar. And if you have 50% of your electricity being generated by wind or solar, and you want to have the lights on all the time, and you don't have the batteries that they haven't built yet, the APS, which is the Arizona utility, has said there's no way that they can absorb the generation from Palo Verde and meet the RPS. So it's a bit of a threat because they don't like the RPS for other reasons. But this kind of thing is happening in California. It's happening in a bunch of places where meeting the renewable portfolio standard says, okay, we don't care what you do with the other 50%. Simple cycle natural gas, diesel turbines, those are fine as long as you hit your carbon, you hit your renewable portfolio standards. So if APS shuts down Palo Verde and meets the RPS, there will be a net carbon intensity increase equivalent of 2.8 million cars on the road if Palo Verde shuts down. Just not, even if the solar and wind do hit 50%, the fact that you're backing that up with natural gas and diesel means your carbon intensity would go up. So the challenge is to protect plants like this, because every time we shut down a plant like this, even if we replace it with renewables, we're like not moving the line, right? We're staying steady, and we need to be going the other direction.
Quick question.
Yeah.
What is the KWE unit?
Kilowatts electric. Just because I'm a nuclear engineer, I was thinking thermal, so I always put the E.
Okay.
Most people would ignore the E.
So that should be like megawatt electric hours?
It's a kilowatt is 1,000 kilowatts is a megawatt.
Right.
So this would be.
So those watts are the same watts.
Yes.
Okay.
No. Sorry. So megawatt hours is a megawatt for an hour.
Right. But like there should be an E after that.
Yes. Megawatt electric hours, but by the time you put the hours, no one cares about the electric.
Okay.
Most people don't care about the electric. In the nuclear world, you're really concerned about thermal power because that's the energy you're dealing with. So people are very specific about saying megawatt thermal versus megawatt electric. Yeah, this would be megawatt electric hours. And that's sort of one plant, and then domestically, 20% of U.S. electricity on average in megawatt hours is produced by nuclear. We're the largest by both capacity. We're the largest by capacity. We have about 100 plants. France is the largest by percentage. They get about 70% of their power from nuclear. And relative to kind of our existing low carbon sources, the solar is 1.3, wind's 5.5, hydro 6.5. Those are going up, but it's just the scale. And this goes back to, when 3 Mile Island happened, there were, I think, 100 reactor orders and 40 under construction. So we had, 10 years ago, we had 104 plants. Had 3 Mile Island not happened, we would have about 250. We'd have about 50% of our power in the U.S. supplied by nuclear. Almost all those plants were canceled that were on order after 3 Mile Island. And that's actually one of the challenging things about economics in today's nuclear power plants is a lot of the sites were built for 6 reactors. So Yellow Canyon has cooling capacity for 6 reactors, but only 2 reactors, and that increases operating costs. So there's strong market pressures from natural gas and renewables. I think being in the Bay Area, there's a lot of nuclear engineers who are like, we have to fight renewables. Like, no, we have to work with renewables to fight climate change. Like, we have to fight natural gas and coal. And natural gas is really cheap right now and putting pressure on a lot of generators. If you look at economic analysis of California, it makes no sense to build any power plant because of our kind of the current market right here. So unless you're getting kind of incentives, building a conventional power plant, like California's utility doesn't really care about that, they'll keep building natural gas plants. But that's sort of the market we have in California, and the US as a whole, it's really challenging to build any power plant, let alone a nuclear power plant.
You say low carbon electric, how low is lowest compared to natural gas?
So actually, so I really hate the term carbon free, because nothing's carbon free. But if you look at it, and IPCC and a lot of people have done this analysis, if you include life cycle carbon intensity, so that's pouring the concrete, making the rebar, building a nuclear power plant is the lowest carbon per kilowatt electricity. Because even though it costs a lot to build it, it produces 0 carbon, essentially, per operation for a really long time with a really high capacity factor. It's about 80% of I'm gonna get this right. Wind or solar, one of them is a little lower. It's about 80% of the best, like offshore wind, maybe I think is the second lowest. And I mean, again, 1/100 of coal or natural gas. Interestingly, since you asked, Jacob, what's the guy? Mark Stanford. Stanford? Mark Jacobs at Stanford. He did analysis I really love. I can't find this paper anymore, otherwise I would put a graph in here. But it's the carbon intensity of different electricity sources. And it has, coal, lignite coal, natural gas, combined cycle natural gas, wind, solar, nuclear, and then nuclear 2. And you're like, what's nuclear 2? When you read the legend, it's like nuclear 1 is like the cost, IPCC estimate of generation. Nuclear 2 is the carbon intensity from vaporizing the cities as a result of nuclear war through the military. So it can be really high if you count that. So yeah. So just a couple more points here. Like, most plants were originally built with a 40-year license. Most plants were built for 6 or 8 year life. So the NRC is in the process of relicensing. It's a pretty thorough relicensing process. Pretty much every plant that's applied for it has gotten it. So maybe don't think that thorough. But a number of plants are just saying we're not going to apply for relicensing. So Diablo Canyon is going to shut down in 2024. It's currently a profitable plant, both with California's renewable standards, the market here, and the cost of relicensing. California's put pretty onerous restrictions on it. PG&E has said we're going to shut down Diablo Canyon, so California will go to 0% nuclear in 2024, which makes me really sad. But makes some people really happy. So there's 99 currently operating reactors, 6 have shut down in recent years. The most depressing of these to kind of nuclear advocates was Keowani. Keowani is a relatively old plant, relatively low capacity, and most nuclear costs are fixed, so like security becomes a huge cost, and it doesn't matter if you're producing 4 gigawatts or 700 megawatts. So Keowani just couldn't make economic sense. If it was a plant that had a license, they just said it costs us less to just turn it off. On the other hand, Illinois and New York pass zero carbon emission tax credits, so sources that don't emit carbon got tax credit. New Jersey passed a somewhat controversial bailout of their nuclear plants at Oyster Creek and I think one other to keep those on. So there's sort of a mix. Wisconsin recently, removed their moratorium on nuclear power. So there's like both pro and con signs going on in the US today. And then kind of the point people don't really like to talk about, so Watts Bar, everyone likes that one, was started in '84 and they just mothballed it after 3 Mile Island. And then TWA a couple years ago said, hey, like it only costs $1 billion to finish this plant, and then we'll have a nuclear power plant for $1 billion. They didn't obey the sunk cost fallacy. So they finished that plant, that turned on. There are 4, it's really 2 because Sumner's pretty much dead, new kind of next generation plus reactors, they're not next gen. Those are kind of being built and they're super expensive.
So how do you explain the difference between the legislation between states? Is it truly politics or is it because of the local options that are different?
I think all politics is local. It's like a good truism I'll just steal. It's both a question of the plants, the history of those plants, the local population, the amount the population cares about climate change, the number of reactors there, the amount the population hates nuclear power. So the divergence is really, Illinois made a huge say about fighting climate change, and then also had really strong connections with sort of utilities, and they had a lot of say. So there was that. I'm not an expert in kind of local politics. I was really surprised New Jersey passed the nuclear bailout. I was happy but surprised. So I can't explain it. I would really want California to consider not shutting down Diablo Canyon, focus on climate change instead of renewables. But I mean, I have very little say in California politics. Yeah.
So didn't New Jersey pass that legislation right after a Democrat replaced Republican Chris Christie?
Yeah.
And that's number 1. And number 2, isn't Diablo Canyon on a fault line? Like, isn't that kind of the biggest problem with Diablo Canyon and why it doesn't have 6 reactors?
No. So yes, it's on a fault line, and I mean, it's designed to take it if you trust that they designed it right. I mean, so it is a risk, and it increases the cost there, it increases the operating costs there. They have extra cooling, extra pipe supports, all the inspection associated with that. it's on a fault line. Like there's no getting around that, and that's not optimal. The challenge of a nuclear power plant is like having access to cold water justifies a huge amount of expense, and most cold water happens to be in like not cold water versus the air, so the ocean water essentially. There's usually geographically challenging things about building next to water because people live there. So Diablo Canyon is on a fault line. There's no getting around that. All of Western California is on a fault line. It's survived every earthquake that's happened. It hasn't survived the earthquake that hasn't happened. The major question is, what are you willing to risk? So I guess my question is this: would you? And this is a rhetorical question, so I won't go through this whole thing. But would you move to London? Right, that's a question I ask people a lot, and people typically say, well, no, I have no reason, but I wouldn't not move to London because of cancer, right? Would you move to Fukushima 1 week before March 2011? Most people say no, because Fukushima is about to have a declining future. But actually, your cancer risk living in Fukushima through the entire duration and not evacuating is less than living in London due to air pollution. So what are we willing to risk? How much sort of cancer are we willing to avoid? Right, like if an earthquake happens and Diablo Canyon melts down, what is the actual risk to people? It's not zero, right? What is the risk to the planet of burning natural gas and burning coal? It's also not zero. So that's sort of the difficult place we find ourselves in. It's not an easy answer, and it's not enough to say, hey, coal is worse, so we can do whatever with a nuclear power plant. But that's at least where I come from. That's that.
Well, when they get a license extension, do they have to do minor upgrades or major upgrades, or?
No, but they have to do those anyway. They're not tied to the license extension. So when the NRC passes like minimum standards, everyone has to upgrade or shut down. So after Fukushima, there was a bunch of upgrades definitely to the Mark I PWR design. And if you were operating, and I don't think I could be wrong, but if you were operating in the US with a Mark I, you had to institute the post-Fukushima upgrades or shut down. You'd lose your license, period. The license extensions are more if you have the capacity to continue safely operating for 20 years. So it's not like there's I could be a little bit wrong on that, but that's generally how it works. The license extension is not tied to upgrades. The upgrades are independent of license extension. So if it was 1 year before your license extension and the NRC passed a new rule, you had to comply or shut down. Didn't matter license. Or 1 year after. Doesn't matter. So I'm going to keep moving. Just international markets. The US can do whatever it wants with nuclear power. We used to be kind of the leader, and we would set technology, we would set, NRC is still seen as the gold standard for safety. But 3/4 of the reactors in the world are not in the United States. China is building reactors at a pace kind of greater than the US ever built them. There's, 20 plus reactors under construction in China. Some estimates are by 2030, China will pass the US in both net generation. A really interesting story is Baraka Unit 1. So this was like the most successful. If you want to be optimistic about nuclear power, look up Baraka Unit 1. In 2010, UAE decided, and UAE has a ton of oil money, so it's not the greatest analogy to every country in the world, but they said we want to protect against a future with oil. It's UAE. They have a lot of solar resources. What do? We want a nuclear power plant because we think that'll help us. So they put out a tender in 2009. In 2010, they got bids back from everyone. They accepted KEPCO, the Korean utility. 2011, they started construction. 2012, they started construction. And this year, this month, the first unit is going to reach operation, so 6 years, 1 gigawatt, which is pretty good. And then the next 3 will come online in the next year or so. And so that's 4 gigawatts of new kind of Gen 3 nuclear power plant being built in about 7 years. So 4 gigawatts, 7 years is pretty good pace. If that is successful, that's 450 kilowatts per person per year of low carbon energy, which would be the fastest rate of low carbon energy ever added, about 10 times faster than Germany's been able to add. You have to caveat that with UAE is like one of the wealthiest per capita people, so that doesn't scale.
Well, if you tell us what it costs, maybe it is applicable for poorer countries.
Oh, okay, so that's true that the Baraka plant, it's really hard with international contracts to get true cost numbers because people play shuffling games. This plant will come in at about $2,300 a kilowatt, or 2.3 cents a watt, or $2.3 a watt, which is really, really competitive. That's better than offshore wind, which is right now the cheapest low carbon, which is typically around like, 20 to or $2 to $4 depending on the location. And 8 reactors are restarted in Japan out of 39. And so Japan is also a really interesting case because they shut down all their reactors after Fukushima and have been really pushing to restart them because they don't have the energy supply. They don't have solar. Their natural gas shipments have to come in as liquid natural gas. More people died, coincidentally, in the tsunami from the natural gas plants exploding than Fukushima. But that's an aside. Actually, if you Google Fukushima accident and you look at images, it's all of the natural gas plant burn, not Fukushima reactor. But, yeah. It is. The big,
Didn't we see 4 of those reactors blowing their own roofs off because they didn't have any cooling facilities? Because all these companies that we're supposed to trust to build all these nuclear plants occasionally on fault lines and do them perfectly, isn't it true that TEPCO was like, yeah, we'll put it with a 6-foot seawall when in fact there could be an 8-foot wave, and then there was no water coming through because the electricity wasn't pumping, and because of those plants not being pumped was full of their coolant, didn't we watch one after the other, 4 of those reactors literally blow their own roofs off? Those weren't natural gas lines, those were the actual reactors.
No, so I'm not trying to, I don't say that to undercut what happened in Fukushima. 4 reactors melted down and exploded. They spewed radiation. They poisoned a lot of land in Japan. I apologize if that's how I conveyed that. If you Google Fukushima and go to images, people use a natural gas plant as an image of the reactors exploding because it's worse than the explosion, which is not necessary because the explosions were bad. I don't mean to undercut that at all. So Fukushima was bad. I just think burning coal and natural gas is worse from both a health and planetary perspective. I accept that things like Fukushima could happen because I want to fight climate change. And I know that's like a tough bargain to make. And to be fair, no one, certainly not me, are proposing that we build more Mark 1 BWRs, right? Like, this is about what we can do in the future. And no one is planning to build the Mark 1 design with no containment, with no high pressure cooling system. And there's a whole bunch of things we can talk about in Fukushima, like what TEPCO did, not good, right? The way TEPCO ran reactors, the way TEPCO handled those plants would not have exploded in the US, coincidentally, because of operating procedures that we have here. There's a lot of like centralized authorities, so they had to get permission to vent from a centralized location with the communication lines they have. So like, they couldn't, in the US, the operating room has full authority to safely run the reactor. In Japan, they didn't. That's one small part of it. So I definitely don't want to downplay Fukushima. It was bad. People died. It poisoned the land in Japan. And 4 reactors exploded. Like, more people died from the natural gas plant exploding. And more people continue to die from breathing coal, from global warming and climate change. That's just the level that I want to set. So apologize if I work in this industry. I can tend to go a little bit trivial on that. Apologize. So yeah.
I have a question, and maybe you're going to cover it. Can you talk at some point, if you have time, around the difference between the Gen 1, Gen 2, and Gen 3 BWR, and then what is the current thing that actually would get built, or what get built in the rocket?
That's actually what I kind of like intended to talk about, but I just find myself rambling about this stuff. So, kind of moving forward, we can do nuclear cheaper. So the TEPCO plants, they basically, those are generation 3+. So generation 1 is the Mark 1 BWR 1970s. These are plants that were sort of designed in the 50s, 60s, built in the 70s. Those are, sorry, Mark 1 is Gen 2. So Gen 1 is pretty much all offline. That was like the Navy building power plants to figure out if they could do shipping port, things like that. Gen 2 was starting to get built in the 70s. Gen 3 started to get built in the 80s. Each of these are learning lessons from previous reactors, but these are 10 to 15 years between generations. Today, Vogel and Summer, AP1000, those are kind of Gen 3+. Vogel and Summer, this is not a good story. If they get built, so Summer is now canceled. It will be infinity dollars a lot because the denominator is 0. And Vogel will be, like 14 to 16 is like, fingers crossed, please don't bankrupt the entire state of South Carolina. So if you look at kind of internationally, most of them focus on USA and France. And the cost of building a reactor has actually gone up over time. There's a bunch of reasons for this. South Korea, there's a paper by Jessica Lovering, which is really great, looking at construction costs sort of current gen plants. And South Korea, which is these lines, they've actually managed to do something which every other industry has managed to do, which is have costs go down over time as they get used to building things. And sort of the conclusions of the paper is they picked a design, they thought this is good enough and we're going to build this thing. They've made minor tweaks to it, but it's the same plant, same construction, same suppliers, everything. They build multi-unit builds. The plants in South Korea are 6-unit plants. So the same security force, essentially, the same operating staff, the same control room staff, a little bit scaled, the same maintenance staff is on site for 6 units, not 2 units. And really, finally, and this is sort of a mixed bag one, is regulatory stability. That's maybe a more optimistic word. The NRC is a completely independent regulatory agency from DOE. So DOE's job is to advocate for nuclear power. NRC's job is to keep the public safe. And they have no concern for cost, for economics, for whatever it is to keep nuclear plants safe. That has made American plants very safe, but it has also caused continual rulemaking and sort of changes in the design process and the construction process driven costs. South Korea's utility has been much more consistent. They said, if you build a plant that does this, you're fine, go for it. And that's something we have to take what we want from as we go forward. So there's good and bad with that. South Korean plants, as far as I know, are very well run, but I don't know that well. And so really, the possible story is these Gen 3 plus plants, what I describe them as is the best rotary phone. So these phones have optimized the spring tension, they've optimized the little clicky wheel, the handset has a nice head. They're old technology, but they're the best version of old technology, and there's something to be said for old technology that you know how to build. There's a thing in nuclear reactors, you could give away the reactor, and the construction costs would still make it unprofitable. And so the cost of all the extra cooling pumps, all the extra water injection, all the extra storage tanks, all the extra reinforced concrete, that's fine as long as you can build the thing on a predictable schedule. And that's sort of one kind of optimistic note internationally. Okay, well, I am definitely now behind schedule given the first one. So I'm going to try and cover some nuclear engineering basics really quickly, and then I'll try and get to sort of the next generation of nuclear technology. What is my time? Was it 9:15? Okay. So I'll try and be done by 9:45, but if anyone has to go, I won't be offended. So just to understand kind of what fission is and isn't. So uranium is the heaviest naturally occurring element. If you hit it with a neutron, it'll split. It'll split into 2 smaller things and release a bunch of neutrons. Those neutrons can hit other uranium elements, cause fission. That's a chain reaction. If that chain reaction sort of propagates, you're sort of stable. The heat, the energy, the actual source of the energy is these 2 fission products slowing down. So they fission, they're moving like 3% of the speed of light, and they slow down, they release a lot of heat. That's the heat from fission. And sort of the excess neutrons keep the reaction going. So not every one of those neutrons is going to hit another uranium atom. Some will fly out, some will get absorbed in steel, some will get absorbed in water, oxygen, whatever, anything you have in there. As long as you have enough of those neutrons hitting uranium, sort of keep the reaction going, you sort of have a nice stable power. Delayed neutrons are really interesting if you guys have like 2 hours to kill on Google, but not tonight. So this is a basic schematic of like a really typical nuclear power plant. So you have the core, that's where heat is generated. The coolant circulates through the core, goes to a steam generator, transfers heat, boils water, makes steam, steam spins the turbine turns a generator, generator powers your PS3. And the kind of water ends up going to a cooling tower, or if it's an older plant, an ocean, kind of open water cooling is definitely kind of out of style nowadays for a number of pretty good reasons. And the water comes back to the steam generator, gets boiled to the steam turbine. If you take everything to the left of this line, this is a coal plant, right? Coal plant, you burn coal, you make hot water boil, or you make steam spin the turbine. The thing that makes a nuclear reactor hard is that you can't turn this off. If you cut the oxygen to a coal plant, it goes to 0 power. It's still hot, and it has to cool down, you have to provide cooling, but it's not producing any more energy. You're not adding energy to the system. The thing that makes designing a nuclear reactor hard is when you stop the chain reaction, you don't go to 0. You go to 7%, which is a lot of power. So, and where that comes from is those fission products decay. And when they decay, they release heat. The fission products have all kinds of radioactive decays, and some of them are very energetic. And so you continue to get heat, about 7% in normal operation, from these things that are not part of the chain reaction. They're just sitting there. And so when you drop the control rods, right, you shut the reactor down. So going sort of supercritical and exploding like a bomb is not a credible accident in any plausible modern reactor design. However, that's pretty much what happened in Chernobyl. That was a really bad design, and I would love to talk for like 2 hours about everything wrong with Chernobyl, because I think it's really fascinating. But most kind of Western reactor designs and modern reactor designs, that's just physically impossible to happen. But what happens is 1 second after you shut down a typical, large-scale 1 gigawatt nuclear power plant, you're producing the same amount of energy as the fuel consumption of a 747 in flight. So 747 in flight, cut the fuel lines, burn that in a fire. That's what's being produced as heat in the core 1 second after shutdown. And 1 day after shutdown, you're the equivalent of the world's largest, most powerful locomotive. Just the fuel consumption of that burning as heat in the core. The problem is, 1 month after shutdown, you're only at the 9th most powerful locomotive. Also highly recommend people use locomotives. It's super cool. They're always used to like move steel in like weird, very cold countries. So that's the problem. You have to dissipate that heat, not just for 1 second, 1 day, or 1 month, but months potentially if you don't restore power. And so that's what's happened in every kind of Western, so Timash, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima. They were able to shut down. The thing was off. It just continued to produce heat. And it would get infinitely hot if you don't remove that heat. It would get hot enough to damage the fuel and cause everything to happen in both 3 Mile Island and Fukushima. Very different accidents, but that's essentially what happened. So in large light water reactors, that's sort of all the reactors that exist today outside of Russia. Russia's really interesting. Is sort of water-cooled reactors. And Decay heat manages in 3 ways. 1, they have a big containment dome. So if you've ever seen a picture of a reactor, you see the cooling towers, but that's not related to the reactor. What you would notice in the US anyway is a big dome. That dome is designed for the entire fuel, all the water to vaporize and turn to steam, the fuel to turn to like uranium vapor, and just sit in there at 50 psi without leaking. That's what those containments are designed to do. They're 4 foot thick reinforced concrete. That's sort of the last defense. Tons of water injection, diesel pumps, diesel generators, water pumps, water supplies. All of that stuff is just designed to be able to continue to remove heat after shutdown. That's the design goal of a light water reactor. And then just while I have people here listening to a nuclear engineer, I do service to all nuclear engineers and talk about radiation versus radioactive material, because these are like very often conflated. So radioactive material is a thing that emits radiation. Uranium, cesium, all these isotopes here are radioactive material. Radiation is actually what does damage to you. So radioactive material, if it's outside your body and far away from you, is harmless. Some radioactive material is also harmless, like if it's, again, far enough away from you or in small enough dose. It's the radiation that you worry about, and those things are very often conflated. So you hear about tritium concentration in the ocean, but that's radioactive material. What you have to ask yourself is, what is the radiation dose to a person, to a plant, to an organism? And that's sort of the more relevant question generally. And the other really important thing about radiation is half-life. So people say, oh, this uranium will be around for 700,000 years, 7 million years, whatever. So activity, which is the amount of radiation released by radioactive material, is inversely proportional to half-life. So the shorter the half-life, the more activity. And so if you have something like potassium-40, it has a half-life of 1 billion years. So in 1 billion years, half of the stuff will be gone. That means in your human lifetime, like there is no radiation. It's pretty harmless. Coincidentally, potassium-40 is bananas, and no one's afraid of bananas. Moly-99, on the other hand, has a 66-hour half-life. This is a waste product from nuclear reactors, also a medical isotope. But if you just leave it somewhere for 600 hours, it's pretty much all gone. And you don't have any radiation to worry about. So if you wanted to deal with Moly-99, you just put it somewhere for like 30 days, and it's all gone. The tough stuff is like cesium-137. That's one of the hardest radioactive waste isotopes to deal with, because that has a half-life of 30 years. It's fast enough to be really dangerous, and yet long enough you have to wait 300 years before it's decayed. So that's just information to take you through the world. I'm going to keep going.
Yes.
So, what are we betting on? So if you ignore all the doom and gloom and all the issues, and you really say, I believe in nuclear, we can save the world, we can make low carbon energy, what is really nuclear? This is sort of what I wanted to talk about. So there's, I would say, 6 options. Small modular reactors, which if you've kind of been in the space, were kind of all the craze until about 4 years ago, and they sort of dropped down a little bit. Molten salt reactors, which are like internet's favorite reactor. Sodium fast reactors, which are physicists' favorite reactors. Gas-cooled reactors, which, for lack of a clever name, I call Germans' favorite reactors, because Germans invented them. And fluoride salt-cooled high-temperature reactors, which is the longest name, so that's cool. That's what I work on. And a lot of people wouldn't, but I put the current gen reactors, because of everything I talked about with South Korea, and I'll get to that maybe later if I have time, which I already don't have. So small modular reactors, what are small modular reactors? It's essentially the same technology, the same fuel assemblies, the same control rods, everything that you know works about a light water reactor, but smaller. And the reason that smaller helps is a few-fold. There's a lot of kind of arguments people make. You can really simplify construction. You're now dealing with smaller components. You don't have to go with these specialized. The reactor vessel from Palo Verde was forged in South Korea, the only forge in the world that can make 81,000 reactor vessels, and shipped, or not 81,000, whatever 800 that is, shipped by barge across the ocean, delivered every night, moving 30 miles by truck. It's a huge ordeal just to move that component. Going to a smaller reactor means you can make them in the United States with more traditional manufacturing technology. But the big thing is you're really reducing the amount of heat. So if you have a 1,000 gigawatt reactor, 1,000 megawatt reactor, you have to deal with 747's decay heat. If you have a 100 megawatt reactor, you have to deal with like a Cessna's decay heat. Way easier to deal with. And the big thing is really using known parts, supply chain, and performance, but dramatically improved safety. So it's all the best technology without some of the challenges. And then the other big argument is financing costs. So if you build a 1 gigawatt plant at $14 a watt, that's $14 billion. That's pretty expensive. On the other hand, even at $14 a watt, a 80 gigawatt or 80 megawatt plant is going to be a lot cheaper just in absolute terms. More utilities can afford that financing. The payback period, because hopefully you can build these things faster, is lower investment, faster time, and hopefully it makes the economics a little more amenable to both smaller economies and kind of current financing.
How does it improve on safety?
So it improves on safety in a couple ways. So the first is really the amount of decay heat, and surface to volume ratio is better. So you're producing less heat with more surface area. You can have more cooling water. If you think about your reactor is really large, the center fuel pin is the one that's going to fail. In that sense, because it has to move that heat out through the entire reactor that's also generating heat. If you take that reactor diameter down a lot, the length of the fuel pins, the diameter, and the fuel assemblies, it's much easier to get that heat out. So NuScale, which I'll talk about in a second, they're kind of a good emblematic one, and I have a diagram. So there's sort of NuScale, which is really the current front runner, and Holtec, Empower, Westinghouse, GE just made some news for something that I don't think they should have been used for. But there's other kind of people. There was this huge push to develop these SMRs, and everyone was like, these are going to change everything, and they didn't change anything because no one built them. So NuScale, though, they have a signed contract or letter of intent, memorandum of understanding with UAMPS, Utah utility. It's going to be co-located with a wind farm. The plant is designed to load follow the wind farm. So as the wind picks up, this plant these will come down. It's like all these things everyone wanted from a nuclear utility. And the way you see the safety is they've gone low enough power and they've sacrificed efficiency that it's powered by natural circulation. There are no pumps. And so if the power trips, nothing changes. It continues to circulate at full power. Just really reduce the volumetric power density of it. And they put these modules, these sort of self-contained modules, in a giant pool. And so there's this huge volume of cooling water and a steel line pool and seismic reinforcements, etc. The challenge is, so here's kind of how their ultimate safety case. If you lost all power and everyone left, eventually the water would boil off, but by the time the water boiled off, the decay heat goes down, and you can cool by air cooling, and you're sort of infinite walkaway safe, unlimited walkaway safe. People have all these qualifiers, but there is nothing you need to do. You don't need to drive a fire truck up. You don't need a hose. That's the goal of every reactor going forward, is to totally change all of the accident scenarios and remove them. So the benefits, as I said, it's an established technology base. It's an established licensing path, which is a huge deal in the U.S. People talk about licensing being really challenging, and it 100% is. And the technology challenges, the risks, the costs, the supply chain, all that's really well understood. Ideally, these are small enough to be quote-unquote factory built, although no one's quite addressed the chicken and egg of, hey, I want to build a factory. How do I afford the factory? I'll sell a bunch of reactors. How do I sell the reactors? You need to have a factory. So that's something that hopefully can just get fixed by money, but who has that money? And then kind of passive cooling or sort of these low power reactors really change the game in terms of safety. The big challenge is it's fundamentally the same technology limitation. So everything you don't like about water reactors is just kind of being engineered around. It's not being solved and not being changed. NuScale is optimistically targeting $6 a watt. That's optimistically for a plant that's never been built. Not going to happen. I feel 100% confident they will not hit $6 a watt if they go forward. It's too much. They still need a ton of money to go through licensing. They're going through a traditional licensing pathway. And many costs of nuclear build do not scale with power level. So even if you reduce the size of the power plant, a lot of licensing costs, fuel costs, security costs, they don't really scale with, hey, we have a smaller plant, or cost should be, it's 1/10 the power, 1/10 the cost. It's 1/10 the power, 90% of the cost. So that's really the challenges of SMRs. Any other question about SMRs?
You said people were really excited about them, and then nobody built them.
Yeah, so mPower, basically, mPower was Babbitt and Wilcox. They did a whole plant, they got everything. TVA was like, hey, we'll build one. And really, the market didn't want it. Natural gas is really cheap. And that's it. Natural gas is cheap, and building a nuclear power plant is expensive. And so the market really just moved away from them. We started deregulating electricity markets, which has had a lot of benefits and has been really challenging for kind of large utility or large scale electricity. So that's pretty much it. It just happened to coincide. If we shifted the clock forward 5 years, and so it was like before Fukushima, before fracking boom, we would have a ton of these. I feel very confident about that. There's a lot of investment in them. It just happened to be like right when they finished was right when like, hey, natural gas is $3 a million BTU. So that was pretty much it. There's kind of this coming at it now because people are still interested in low carbon nuclear power. So not good. I don't need to. After. Anyone else? Okay. So yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay. So passive cooling is the way that a traditional nuclear power plant cools is they say you lose offsite power, you shut the plant down, and now you need to remove that decay heat. So you have batteries and diesel generators that turn on and start providing active cooling. They're pumping water through the core, pumping it through heat exchangers, removing that heat, coming it back to the core. Eventually, you have you have all these systems that are reliant on stored electricity, whether it's diesel fuel or offsite power or batteries. The passive cooling means you're only relying on physics. So you're relying on water rises when it gets hotter, and that causes circulation, or your air does the same thing. High temperature things radiate. That's passive cooling. It's inherent safety rather than engineered safety is how other people define it. So at the lower power levels, for a gigawatt plant, you can't do passive cooling. It's too inefficient. For a 80 megawatt plant, you can do passive cooling, where you're just relying on water circulating, condensing, cooling, coming back. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, who here has heard of molten salt reactors? Who here thinks thorium is going to change the Oh wow. Okay. See, I live in like a super bubble where like everyone, I'm just like, no, thorium. So I won't do as much time beating down on thorium. So the internet really loves thorium though. If you go on Reddit and type in thorium, there's like 4 million threads about it. So there's actually my friend Nick Turan has a really great website called whatisnuclear.com. I highly recommend it. It's better than the talk. And he has a really good page on like the truth and lies. I don't know. He has a better word than lies. About thorium. So what is thorium? Thorium is it's called a fertile element. So it's not fissile. You can't hit it with your neutron and get fission. But if you hit it with a neutron and you wait like 27 hours, it becomes a fissile isotope, and then you can breathe fuel. There's way more thorium in the Earth's crust than uranium, and that's pretty much it. It's a means of generating more fuel than you have currently without mining uranium. People really love it a little bit more than it deserves. That's fine. So they conflate that too. There's thorium and there's molten salt reactors. So molten salt reactors do not have to use thorium. Thorium does not have to be used in molten salt reactors. Molten salt reactors, coincidentally, were first invented for the aircraft reactor experiment, which is before ICBMs, how do you bomb the Soviets with like a really reliable bomber? Nuclear power. So this is a spherical nuclear reactor surrounded by a spherical shield connected to 4 jet engines. They built this in Ohio, Cincinnati. They still have the test stand set up. GE, there's 2, GE, and there's another one in Idaho. They really planned to do this. Actually, I'm going to take this tangent. One of the ways they tested how the shielding worked was not like build this thing on the ground somewhere and like stand really far away and be like, hey, the shielding works. They built it, they put it on a plane and flew it overhead, and they're like, the shielding works. Doesn't work. Oh, that's not work. Yeah, that was a bad idea. But anyway, they're really cool. From a like nerdy engineering standpoint, less so from an aircraft reactor experiment standpoint. So it's possible to run a molten salt reactor. What a molten salt reactor is, I guess I haven't said that, is think about a light water reactor. It's fuel pins, solid fuel, metallic fuel, sort of, with water running by to cool it. The water boils and produces steam and whatever. A molten salt reactor does not use water as cooling. It uses salt. So think table salt. Now think table salt at 800 C. It melts. It becomes a liquid. It's really high temperature liquid. It's really stable. It does not boil. So the challenge with water as a coolant is at 1 atmosphere, water boils at 100 degrees C. Everyone loves the Celsius scale for that. It's 100 C, 1 atmosphere. So light water reactors run at like 20 atmospheres. 155 atmospheres. They super pressurize it to be able to get, but they can only get to like 300 C, which is not that hot. And now you have this like 8-inch thick steel vessel containing the pressure. Molten salt reactor can run at atmospheric pressure. It does not need to pressurize from high temperature. So if you have a fault, if you have an accident, everything just doesn't want to go anywhere. You don't have any fuel to melt down because it's already molten. They're really low pressure systems, and everyone says, oh, they're low pressure, they're going to be really cheap. The MSR, this is sort of a schematic of an MSR. So you have a core. The core is just a big region where the neutron leakage is low, and so you have enough neutrons flying around to kind of create fission heat. That makes your fuel salt hot, so this is fuel and coolant. You flow that through a heat exchanger, apply that too, to have a buffer region. You flow that around, and you then kind of whether run a gas or kind of steam system or whatever. That's the basics of how a molten salt reactor works. I won't talk about the freeze plug, but no one's going to use a freeze plug in practice. But if you guys haven't heard of it, has anyone heard of it? Does anyone understand why freeze plugs don't work? Okay.
I don't know why freeze plugs don't work.
Okay, basically in 20 seconds, everyone says, oh, okay, here's how the freeze plug is supposed to work, and this is how the test reactor worked. It has air cooling going through a pipe that's at the bottom of the reactor. You lose power. If any accident happens, the freeze plug melts, the salt drains out of the core. It sits in these like cooling tanks, passive cooling, subcritical, whatever. That's true, and that's how the 8 megawatt reactor was built. If you actually look at the economics of this, you now have twice the reactor vessel qualified material surface area, and you have to excavate a tank below your reactor that's seismically qualified. That's basically has to go to the same qualification as your reactor below the tank. These things can get really hot safely, and dropping control rods is really easy. So to get around that with like an entire whole engineering program, everyone who's credibly looking at MSRs doesn't use the term tank, but everyone on YouTube really likes the term tank, so I have to hate on it. The US did build a molten salt reactor in the 60s. Did that make sense about the new things?
Yes.
Okay. US built a molten salt reactor in the 60s. It's pretty cool. They did it in like 2 years, and this thing ran for 2 years at 8 megawatts. And because you've removed a lot of this whole structural material, the cladding, the material to hold your fuel bundles, your assembly, you have really good neutron economy. You get really good efficiency. You can do all kinds of cool stuff with the extra neutrons. And the last thing is you can remove fission products in operation. So a lot of the really challenging fission products, one of them is xenon. So xenon is the reason the plants don't load follow. And I'll explain after if people are interested, but it's basically, it tries to shut the plant down if you load follow, and it happens to have the same time cycle as like a human day. So it like happens to just be the worst possible thing where if you try to load follow, you need a ton of safety margin to be taken out for really coarse understanding. With a molten salt reactor, the xenon would boil out. Essentially, it's a non-condensable gas. And you can continually remove it in operation. You don't have to do a xenon, which means you have a much safer reactor and a much better operating reactor. So the benefits of thorium / molten salt reactors, there's no possibility of meltdown. Sorry, there's a really strong negative temperature coefficient, but every reactor has a strong negative temperature coefficient. Low pressure, no containment, that's a big deal. So these things, if they have an accident, and you can kind of define what an accident is, it's really very contained by physics. Even if you remove the top from this thing, there's not a lot of stuff that has motive force to get anywhere because it's operating at atmospheric pressure. Because you have really good neutron economy, you can make use of fuel. You can convert or breathe. You can convert thorium. You can make plutonium if you wanted to. So it eliminates some proliferation concerns. Uranium-233 is bad for weapons, and if you breed from thorium, you end up with uranium-233. However, there's this whole argument that takes a second to get through, but if you trust someone to not put uranium-238 into this thing, you already trusted them to build a reactor and operate it. Like, if you put uranium-238 into this thing, you'll make a ton of plutonium. That's really easy to extract and very good quality. And people like tend to ignore that. They say, oh, well, we're just going to put thorium in. It's like, well, then you already trusted people not to breed plutonium from some other means when they readily could have. So that's, maybe I didn't make that argument concisely, but catch me after. High temperature, high efficiency is a big thing. So the major challenge with molten salt reactors that people don't talk about is corrosion. So when you have molten salt reactor, you have every element in the periodic table in contact with your structural metal. If any of you have done structural materials, it's really, really challenging because you can't get chemistry control. And so the US built a reactor, they operated for 2 years, and maybe could have lasted for 3 or 4 before they started to just completely corrode everything. There's maybe a material called hastelloy that could stand up to that, but even then it's very limited in lifetime, and most of the data has been pretty mixed on hastelloy. And even if it is, hastelloy is incredibly expensive. I tried to buy 3 kilograms of hastelloy once for an experiment, and they asked how many tons I wanted. There's no supply base. You can't go and buy components to make things from it. You have to like custom smelt it, and that's really challenging when you're trying to build a new reactor. And circulating fuel is really challenging from a licensing and operating standpoint. Your heat exchanger has uranium in it, and plutonium for that matter. And supply chain operational experiences will apply to everything, but mostly this one is fairly non-existent. So that's molten salt reactors. Questions? Yes?
Can you just remind us, what are the temperatures of SMRs and MSRs?
Yes. So a light water plant is about 325 C, and thermal efficiency, which is a weird metric for nuclear power plant because you're not paying that much for the fuel, but thermal efficiency is like 30%, give or take. SMRs are the same, so 325 C, that's basically limited by the pressure you can go to. These can conceivably go as high as about 700 C, which is closer to like the upper limit of kind of whole plants, more or less, when you look at the power conversion side. So it's about, which is about a 15% increase in thermal efficiency.
And these run at 1 atmosphere, pressures?
That's sort of a question that hasn't been answered because no one designed them. There's trades. You can run it at 1 atmosphere. You might choose to run it a little higher pressure for a couple like operational reasons, namely kind of like corrosion or chemistry control. Like even though you don't have to, you want to keep corrosion down. You want to keep atmospheric oxygen and water out of the system. So you might pressurize it a little bit to keep that force out, and then for some operational reasons related to like filling and draining, you might have these things pressurized. But for the most part, you're talking about like 1 extra atmosphere, so like the 10th of the pressure in your bike tires, versus like 10 times the pressure in bike tires.
So the Oak Ridge reactor was never actually built. It was just.
So Oak Ridge ran Msr, which was an 8 megawatt test reactor, and I apologize if I misstated that. They ran out for 2 years, and then after that program, they had plans for a bigger reactor called MSPR, and that was never built. The aircraft reactor experiment was built, but only like the power conversion side of it, and like a dummy reactor. They never built the full system. Is that good?
Well, just because you said nobody's ever built it, so we don't know.
No one's ever built a commercial. reactor. So the Oak Ridge reactor was a test reactor. It didn't have any back-end system. It was because it was really small, they could get away with a few things that essentially you couldn't do at a commercial plant. The entire thing was built in an oven because it was small. If they made the thing larger, you couldn't. You had to deal with heat up melting, which is pretty challenging.
Should we build this?
No.
Why?
So I'll kind of summarize this at the end for both SFRs and MSRs. There's a reason to build SFRs. I think the risk building MSRs isn't borne out by the benefits. It's certainly not in the widespread context. Maybe I didn't say we shouldn't. Like, I don't know that we shouldn't. I'm very skeptical, and I think that the other technology has given the risk and given the challenge of being wrong, this isn't where I would put my money.
Can you clarify the risk, because the benefits challenges columns for me are hard to...
The risk in my mind is that this won't be a viable long-term technology, and I'm mainly worried about corrosion, cost, and actual operation. This has a lot of, so terrestrial energy is a big player in Canada, and TerraPower are both investing a lot of money in this. So I'm not saying it can't be done, and I'm not saying it doesn't make any sense. There are a lot of benefits. I'm very skeptical that the corrosion issues and the operational challenges will justify the benefits relative to other technologies.
Gotcha.
Can the salt be changed into something else, like lead?
Yeah, you can, and that would be a totally different reactor. The thing about the salt is the reason to use kind of these type of salts is the fission products, the fuel dissolves in it. So uranium doesn't dissolve in lead. It'll condense out and you wouldn't get it circulating. So lead-cooled fast reactors are super cool, and I'll talk about them in a second. They're actually good. But they have their own challenges. I tend to be a pretty pessimistic person and cynical, so I say, like, I'm always worried about what won't work. I want the dreamers to make things actually work. NSRs are the one that seem the furthest away to me. So, anyone else?
Bismuth?
What?
Bismuth?
So lead bismuth, sodium. I call sodium fast reactors because that's the most prominent technology, but it's basically the same for lead bismuth. Those are all similar. Russia's done a lot with those, and people have looked at them. I think we should build these, but I'll talk about them. So liquid metal, so lead bismuth, sodium, but really sodium is the one that's gotten the most attention. Fast reactors. So the thing about fast reactors is they operate with totally different physics from thermal reactors. Every other reactor I've talked about, every other reactor that's pretty much operating in the world outside of Russia is thermal spectrum, which means they slow the neutrons down, which creates very predictable physics and makes the reactors very controllable, makes them easy to operate, makes them easy to analyze. Fast reactors take the opposite. They say, I'm going to leave all the neutrons fast. Neutrons are born fast. They're born at a few percent the speed of light. And I'm literally talking about the speed that they travel. So that's what fast reactors means, is the speed of the neutrons. And when these neutrons collide with fissile isotopes, they basically blow them apart and release way more neutrons. So rather than 2 or 3, as you kind of saw in the previous picture, they can release as many as 10, which changes, you can have higher leakage, you can accept all these other things happening. And you can, due to some other kind of high energy physics, you can breed fuel really efficiently. So fast reactors can use sometimes 200 times, it's as much as you want. You can put in some amount of fuel and get almost an arbitrary amount of fuel out. They're really efficient breeders because the reactions you want to happen preferentially at higher energy relative to low energy. So they're really efficient in terms of fuel utilization. And they can also burn harmful waste. Because most of the absorption for waste isotopes or fission products is at thermal energies, you're basically those happen in the background. You're not concerned with them in terms of operating the reactor and keeping it stable, and you can just be shoving spent fuel, you can be shoving kind of fission products in there, and they will absorb neutrons, turn into something else, decay, burn, get split apart by fast neutrons. And so they're fairly efficient at getting rid of waste, and then also breeding more fuel. That's why the US has been looking at them since the 50s. the major challenge is they need specific coolants, such as lead or liquid sodium, that have low cross sections and high energy, and also kind of similar properties to the salts. They have fairly low boiling points, good thermal conductivity. Obviously, if anyone's ever taken high school chemistry, the major challenge with sodium is it's really a friend of oxygen and water and wants to make fire together. And so sodium fire has become a major operational challenge. You have double-walled pipes and purge gases and things like that that make these expensive to operate. The U.S. has built and demonstrated sodium fast reactors. Russia has the operating sodium fast reactor, the VN800. They also have kind of 6 or 7 others. They've used these on submarines. Russia has built a lot of sodium fast reactors. And China is or was looking at them as well. But these have been built at fairly large scale. So kind of this is what I was trying to show before. I think I'll skip the graph. Yeah, I pretty much explained that. So sodium fast reactors, the benefits is really improved fuel utilization. So you put in a little bit of uranium, you get a lot of fuel out. You can burn spent fuel and waste. It requires you to reprocess, but you can get rid of excess fuel. So inherent passive safety, they have a lot of those same features because they can go to higher temperatures that the molten salt reactors have too. High temperatures, negative temperature feedback, so they'll shut themselves down. And because the coolant doesn't boil, you can go to higher temperatures and let sort of natural circulation or natural cooling means cool the reactor, and so you don't have the same kind of shutdown heat removal issues. Higher temperatures in LWR, so these typically go about 500 C, and there really is significant operating experience, though it is somewhat challenging. France built a reactor that had operating experience, and it was not good, but they built it. I forgot to mention that. So the challenge is sodium fire's risk. Sorry? Sodium fire is a safety and operational challenge. You have to design against a sodium fire. Even if you can contain it, you still have to deal with it in design, cost, things like that. To close the fuel cycle and to get that really great fuel utilization requires reprocessing, which is the same way you would make kind of weapons-grade plutonium or anything else. And it's an activity that's dangerous, hazardous, and generates some waste. So, or a lot of waste and toxic waste. So there's a reason to not do it. Operating experience in the West has been poor, although Russia's managed to kind of figure out a way to run these. And these things are relatively large in physical size. They're about 3 to 4 times the size of a light water reactor, and so you have to go to different construction techniques, different excavations, things like that. When I say I think these are things we should build, I really don't talk about it in the broad scale. This is really a way to make fuel, a way to deal with waste, less than building these kind of on every corner. I think we can figure out how to build these better and larger. There's a lot of reasons to do so, but I'm not sure these will work out for like building these for small towns and things like that. The thing about lead bismuth reactors and lead core reactors is you get that really high fuel utilization, so you can almost make what's called a nuclear battery. So you can put enough fuel to just have something welded shut for 30 or 40 years to generate electricity without a refueling outage. If you're operating at fairly low power, so you can get some cool physics going on to make that work, and pretty much the only way to do that is with lead or sodium fast reactors.
What is the one American?
Lead water reactors. So actually, and if you go to the molten salt reactor advocates, they'll say the reason that the U.S. has PWRs and therefore the world has PWRs is because the U.S. built water-cooled reactors for submarines, and water reactors are great for submarines because there's a lot of water nearby. You never have to worry about your, cooling water drying up because the ocean is very large. But there's a couple other reasons than that. But that's American submarines or PWRs. That was shipping port was the first reactor in the U.S. That's really the technology base in the U.S. is the pressurized water reactors, like that diagram I showed. And most Russian submarines are also water. Just a few. Anyone else? Gas-cooled reactors, pebble-bed reactors. I'll go through this a little quicker. The cool thing here is about triso fuel. So the Germans invented this stuff called triso fuel. And the basic idea is the containment that I talked about before, this huge concrete structure that assumes that your water boils and explodes. release a lot of energy, you want to contain that. What TRISO is you take the fuel and you surround it by silicon carbide, this crystal structure that's really strong, really high retention capability for kind of radionuclides, and it keeps all of your waste in one place. It keeps all the fission products in one place, and so you sort of, I call it, invert the containment logic. So rather than building one really large containment, you're building a million really small containments, and that creates a different kind of failure mechanism of, okay, you have a containment, it's either intact or failed. If it's intact, everyone's happy. If it's failed, everyone's unhappy. With TRISO fuel, you have 10 million containments. So if 10 to the minus 6 of them, or 1 out of every million of them fail, you have an insignificant release, just because it's only 1 millionth of your fuel that's sort of releasing fission products. And so these become easier to build in a lot of ways than container domes, because you can make these in an assembly line, you make these in a factory. So this is 1 millimeter in diameter. You have fuel, you have a few buffer layers, and you have silicon carbide. And you pack these into spheres. You pack those spheres into a core, and that's what your core looks like. So pebble bed reactors, you can also do these as sort of traditional fuel assemblies, but pebble bed has been where most people have gone. And then you circulate gas. The gas is just acting as a heat transfer mechanism. Like conduction and radiation is enough to deal with decay heat, and so you don't have to build. You don't worry about if you have a leakage or you have a depressurization event. You haven't compromised the safety because you're not relying on it anyway. The Germans sort of developed this. The U.S. has been looking at it for a long time. This stuff is pretty bulletproof. They've tested this up to 1800 C without incremental fuel failure, which is really hot and really impressive. And it really gets to kind of the stress distribution on a very small spherical pressure vessel. You can get to really high stresses without reaching failure. Germany, China, US, Japan are all looking at this. China's they built a test reactor called HTR-10. They're building a demonstration reactor called HTR-PM. The US built one of these, something very similar to this in the 60s. They looked at this for a really long time. This is what the government was like putting all their chips on up until about 2010 when they canceled the program. It's called NGNP. And there's currently kind of a company called X Energy working with the government essentially to build this fuel fabrication line back in the US.
Is it much more expensive to make than regular?
It's much more expensive to make. It's about 50 times more expensive to make per kilogram of uranium. And the way you try to justify that economics is you don't have the containment dome, you don't have the water cooling, you don't have the injection lines. So it's basically going to, you take a nuclear safety and put it just in the fuel, as opposed to all the redundant systems that are expensive, the electrical systems, the containment structure and things like that. You can verify this, you can do QC on this on a particle by particle basis, and you don't have to do that on construction projects. You can do it in a lab. You're not like some guy named Ed with a clipboard. So that's the promise anyway.
These are 1 millimeter diameter?
So this is 1 millimeter in diameter. You have about 5,000 of them in a 6 centimeter sphere. And then you'll have maybe 40,000 spheres in a reactor.
Oh, okay. So it's not like just a bunch of sand, but they're
No. Yeah, they're packed in it. And these things are, right, so they're 6 centimeter, about the size of a tennis ball.
Okay.
Graphite, so very hard ceramic material. You can like drop them and bounce them. They generate dust, and there's serious operational challenges with that. But they've been operated. South Africa had a really big program called PDMR. That was going to build one of these and start selling it, and they stopped. So a whole bunch of reasons why, but they did. So that basically the technical basis behind that company moved to the U.S., became X Energy. I also would take this opportunity to say that these are all my opinions and not those of my employer or anyone that I speak for. And so the benefits, so TRISO fuel, that's the name of those fuel kernels, is pretty impressive stuff. It leads to this kind of inherent safety and containment. As you've taken the challenge of nuclear safety from your construction project to your supply chain, essentially. The other thing is because you have these pebble fuel, you can be pretty clever if you want and do what's called online refueling. So you're taking spent fuel at the bottom, putting fresh fuel on the top, and you don't have to shut down for refueling outages, which means you can get even higher capacity factors than like a light water plant, which has a typically 1 to 2 month long refueling outage every 18 months. And again, simplified nuclear safety. There's no coolant. These things are already in a configuration for passive safety when you shut them down. They'll cool themselves down and sit there. So the challenge is gas is a really inefficient coolant. So even at even at really high pressure, you are still dealing with the fact that gas doesn't have a lot of stuff to get hot. And so generating steam from that requires you to circulate a lot of gas, and that's just a challenging process to make economically efficient. Because these things operate at kind of low power density, you can only generate so much heat from a single ball without kind of reaching that 1800 C for some of the kernels. So you have to have these really huge structures. So that's challenging from a supply chain perspective and a construction perspective. Some of these things are 20 meters tall, 5 meters in diameter. So that's just big. And they're operate at really high pressure, and so you have all of your systems and components that operate at that pressure. It becomes an operational challenge. Pebble handling is complex. If you don't do pebble handling, you have prismatic fuel. That's also complex, where you basically have more traditional fuel assemblies, but because the power density is low, you have to be shuffling these things around and replacing them fairly often. And finally, kind of graphite lifetime, and that's another challenge I didn't mention for the molten salt reactors. Graphite, anything in the core of a reactor can only survive so long from radiation dose. Graphite can't last forever, and so for both gas-cooled reactors and molten salt reactors, graphite lifetime is a challenge. So I'll just briefly mention this. This is what I work on. Fluoride cell-cooled high-temperature reactor, because it's what I work on. I'm not going to talk about it that much. It's also really recent. These haven't been built or proven or demonstrated. It's more experimental. The fundamental concept is you take the coolant from the molten salt reactors and the fuel from the TRISO, from the gas-cooled reactors, and combine them. So you get the efficient coolant, the power density and everything from the molten salt reactors, but you have the fuel without the challenge of circulating fuel. You don't have the challenge of circulating fuel like you do in a molten salt reactor. You don't have the challenge of a really bad coolant like you do in a gas reactor. That's the premise. That's the promise. And a lot of people who've looked at kind of eventually going towards molten salt reactors, developing the chemistry. Chemistry control is easier because you don't have the fuel circulating. And so people have proposed these reactors as a step towards molten salt reactors. And then finally, the current generation. So we can build LWRs today. They may not be perfect, but they work. So that's really my kind of, not where I've talked myself to while making these slides, but sort of where I'm coming around to as I think about this. If you want to build a plant today, it's really challenging to say, I'm going to build a technology that is still going through design certification, is still going through licensing. I don't know when it'll be built for how much. I can put a tender in and get an order tomorrow, starting under construction. And that's sort of at least one option for the near term. And then finally, if we do none of these things, reactors in space are super cool. It's what I started working on. And there will always be a reason to build reactors in space. Space is really cool. You can use them for propulsion. You can use them for space bases. You can use them for whatever fission power, fuel power wants to use for space. Yeah, space. Just doing stuff in space. So thank you guys for coming out, listening to me. I know I kind of rambled a little bit. But